Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. We continue our tour of the cities of the ancient world. We have been to the four primordial patriarchal sees, the four great capitals, so to speak, of ancient Christianity. Well, today we take our first steps outside that elite group, though we arrive at a city with no less impressive a Christian pedigree. Ephesus burst into Christian history as the scene of a riot by the souvenir salesman. We visited Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, and Alexandria, and each of those is today a living city. Jerusalem is still thriving and fought over. Antioch has bounced back as a small but substantial city in Turkey. Rome is still a major capital filled with evidence of its centuries of history. Alexandria is a bustling metropolis on the Mediterranean. But Ephesus is just gone. You can visit the site today. Archaeologists have dug up some impressive ruins. They've put them together in picturesque arrangements for tourists to take selfies in front of. But it's an uninhabited wasteland. When the last tour bus leaves in the evening, no one is left but the birds and the lizards. But remember the riot of the silversmiths, and we can begin to tease out some of that lost importance. When we visited Alexandria, we passed one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the lighthouse at Alexandria. Ephesus was home to another one of the famous wonders, the Temple of Artemis, the goddess known to the Romans as Diana. It probably looked like other Greek temples, but on a scale we find hard to imagine. It was as long as a football field and a half. It had more than 100 columns. It was as tall as a 6-story building, not nearly as tall as the lighthouse, but still tall enough to seem dizzyingly high. An ancient Greek poet named Antipater thought it was the most wonderful of all the seven wonders. He wrote, "I have set eyes on the wall of lofty Babylon, on which is a road for chariots, and the statue of Zeus by the Alpheus, and the hanging gardens, and the colossus of the sun, and the huge labor of the high pyramids, and the vast tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the house of Artemis that mounted to the clouds, those other marvels lost their brilliancy, and I said, Lo, apart from Olympus, the sun never looked on anything so grand." You may have noticed the slight variation in the list of wonders. The lighthouse isn't there. Instead, Antipater mentions the walls of Babylon. Pilgrims from all over the Roman world came to see the temple, and wherever there are tourists, there are people ready to sell them souvenirs. The silversmiths of Ephesus did a brisk business in little metal replicas of the temple and statue. Then came Paul, preaching that idols like Artemis and Ephesians were false. False gods, nothing but stone and metal and wood. And he was winning converts. He even had friends among the ruling class. What would happen to that flourishing souvenir business if these Christians succeeded in persuading people that Artemis was not really a divine being? Who would buy the little silver replicas then? This is the story Luke tells in the 19th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. About that time there arose no little stir concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of like occupation and said, Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable company of people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours might come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may count for nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged and cried out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Well, what follows is one of the most vivid descriptions of a riot to come down from the ancient world. We know that cities were full of riots, but Luke, with his physician's eye for detail, gives us the anatomy of a riot. This is what he says. So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. Paul wished to go in among the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Some of the Asiarchs also, who were friends of his, sent to him and begged him not to venture into the theater. To interrupt Luke for a moment, we don't know exactly what position Asiarchs held, but we know they were important officials in the administration of the province. This may tell us something about why the silversmiths were so agitated. Paul was making friends in high places. We also notice that the rioters assembled in the theater. In Ephesus, the theater was huge. Modern historians think it was the largest in the Roman Empire. That may give us some idea of the size of the mob. Luke continues, giving us a remarkable portrait of mob psychology. Now some cried one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander motioned with his hand, wishing to make a defense to the people. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all with one voice cried out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." This was a bad and dangerous situation. A mob chanting slogans can turn violent quickly. It looked as though they might turn violent against Jews in the city, and there were a lot of Jews in Ephesus. The city authorities were alarmed, and one of them managed to get up in front of the mob and get their attention, as Luke tells us. And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be contradicted, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash, for you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If, therefore, Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, there being no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." Thus the riot ended before it had done any damage. The town clerk had pointed out to the people what danger they were in. We saw in the case of Antioch that the whole city was responsible for any crimes committed during a riot, and it could be very bad if the governor or the emperor himself decided that Ephesus needed to be taught a lesson. There are official ways a citizen can bring charges against these Christians, he tells the people. So if they're really doing something wrong, the regular channels will take care of it. This priceless portrait of a city in commotion tells us that Paul had been very successful in Ephesus, so successful that the souvenir salesmen thought their jobs were on the line. In Athens, Paul had been treated as an interesting crank, with some new philosophy that might be fun to listen to. In Ephesus, he was building a church. Later, Paul would write a letter to that church. Some of Paul's most famous and beloved thoughts are in that letter, including the passage from Ephesians 5 that's read at many weddings. He who loves his wife loves himself. When we compare it to the letters to the Corinthians and the one to the Galatians, we get the impression that Paul wasn't nearly as worried about the Ephesians. The church in Corinth seems to have been a problem child from the start. But Paul doesn't have to tell the Ephesians to knock it off and stop poking each other in the back seat. We have the same impression from St. Ignatius of Antioch, who also wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus while he was on his way to Rome and martyrdom. He praises the Ephesians' faith over and over, mentioning in particular how they refused to listen to false teachers. Christian tradition tells us that there were some false teachers to be found at Ephesus, but after the reign of Domitian, John the Apostle was there as well. He had been exiled to the Aegean island of Patmos, where tradition says he wrote the Revelation. In the beginning of that book, the angel has a message for Ephesus, and John also mentions how the Ephesians refused to listen to false teachers, in particular the Nicolaitans. Eusebius tells us that John was recalled from Patmos after Domitian died, when the Roman Senate decreed a general return of the political exiles. He settled in Ephesus. St. Irenaeus passes on one story about John's time in Ephesus, told by John's disciple Polycarp, whom I saw also in my early youth, Irenaeus tells us, for he lived a very long time. Here's what he says. And there are some who have been told by him how John, the Lord's disciple, was in Ephesus, going to bathe. And when he saw Cerinthus in that place, he leaped out of the bath without using it, adding, "Run away, or the bath itself might fall on us, since Cerinthus, the enemy of truth, is in it." Cerinthus seems to have been one of those Nicolaitans mentioned in the Revelation, or someone who developed their doctrines into his own system. Irenaeus also tells us that John wrote his gospel while he was at Ephesus. Modern scholars debate whether John the Apostle was really the writer of that gospel, but Irenaeus is not many steps away from the facts. Irenaeus knew Polycarp, and Polycarp knew John. Because John was there, some traditions say that Mary, the mother of the Lord, was with him. We remember that just before he died on the cross, Jesus made John responsible for his mother. Many traditions say that she was still in Jerusalem when she fell asleep, but in Ephesus they believed that Mary had come there with John. There's a house in the country outside the ruined city that is shown to pilgrims as the Holy Virgin's house. Was it really? Some say yes, and some say no. But what is unquestionable is that the people of Ephesus became very attached to the Blessed Virgin. As Ephesus became Christian, she replaced Artemis of the Ephesians as the protector of the city. Though John lived at Ephesus, tradition tells us that the city's first bishop was St. Timothy, the friend and protege of Paul. Timothy was a Greek Jew who had been familiar with Scripture since he was a child. The church in Ephesus grew to be one of the most influential in the Eastern Mediterranean world. It claimed authority over all the churches in Asia, meaning the Roman diocese of Asia. As the power of Constantinople grew, Ephesus held on to its own prestige and was inclined to side with the opposition if there was any dispute that put the bishop of Constantinople on one side. The biggest of those disputes came up in the year 431 when Nestorius became bishop of Constantinople. We remember from our visit to Alexandria how Nestorius created a big stir in the church with his supposed technical distinctions about the Mother of God. According to the historian Socrates Scholasticus, the trouble all started with a priest named Anastasius, who had come with Nestorius from Antioch and who was one of the new bishop's most trusted advisors. One day Anastasius was preaching in the church and he said, "Let no one call Mary Mother of God, for Mary was only a woman, and it is impossible that God should be born of a woman." These words created a great sensation, says Socrates, and troubled many both of the clergy and the laity. Up to now they had been taught to acknowledge Christ as God, and by no means to separate his humanity from his divinity on account of the economy of incarnation. Nestorius thought a lot of Anastasius, so he defended his priest in his own sermons. Nestorius was also the sort of preacher who liked to make fussy technical distinctions. He said that you could call Mary Mother of the Christ, Christotokos in Greek, but technically you couldn't call her Theotokos, Mother of God. The general impression, Socrates says, was that Nestorius was tainted with the errors of Paul of Samosata and Photinus and wanted to foist on the church the blasphemous dogma that the Lord is a mere man. Socrates adds that these accusations were probably unfair to Nestorius, but Nestorius brought them on himself by misunderstanding what he was preaching. He gives us a character study of Nestorius that shows us a man whose fatal flaw was proud self-confidence. Here's Socrates. having myself perused the writings of Nestorius, I shall candidly express my own beliefs about him, and as I have already, with no personal antipathies at all, mentioned his faults, I shall likewise be unbiased by the accusations of his adversaries to detract from his merits. I cannot then concede either that he was a follower of the heretics with whom he was thus classed, or that he denied the divinity of Christ. But he seemed scared at the term Theotokos, as though it were some terrible phantom. The fact is, the causeless alarm he manifested on this subject just exposed his grievous ignorance. For instead of being a man of learning, as his natural eloquence caused him to be considered, he was in reality disgracefully illiterate. Because he could express himself so easily, he had contempt for the drudgery of an accurate examination of the ancient expositors, and he was puffed up with the vain confidence in his own powers. Well, Nestorius seems to have been puffed up with enough confidence to think that a council of the church would confirm his own beliefs. But some of his confidence evaporated when he heard that the council would be held at Ephesus. Ephesus, the city that just might be more enthusiastic than any other about the Mother of God. We get the impression that Nestorius was a bit worried not only about the outcome of the council, but also about his physical safety. Immediately after Easter, therefore, says Socrates, Nestorius, escorted by a strong body of his adherents, went to Ephesus and found many prelates already there. Nestorius was counting on support from some of his old friends from Antioch, but John, the current bishop of Antioch, was delayed, along with a number of other Eastern bishops. As we remember from our visit to Alexandria, Cyril, bishop of Alexandria and the chief opponent of Nestorius, had been made president of the council. Following the emperor's schedule to the letter, he convened the council before John and the others arrived. Nestorius refused to consider the council in session until his friends from the east were there. The result was that the meeting was made up of Cyril and Cyril's supporters. So by the time the Easterners got there, Nestorius had already been condemned and deposed. Well, John was furious when he found out that he had been left out. He convened a counter-council, which condemned and deposed Cyril. Cyril and his supporters deposed John. Now, John and Cyril would be reconciled later. Too late, Nestorius decided it wasn't worth fussing over technical terms. As Socrates tells us, when Nestorius saw that the contention which had been raised was thus tending to schism and the destruction of communion, in bitter regret he cried out, "Let Mary be called Mother of God, if you will, and let all disputing cease." But although he made this recantation, no notice was taken of it, for his deposition was not revoked, and he was banished to the Oasis, where he still remains. The Oasis was a habitable spot in the remote Egyptian desert, where the most intractable and dangerous people were sent to get them out of the way. When Socrates was writing, Nestorius was still there. He lived some time writing his memoirs, which were rediscovered in the 1800s. It turns out he thought life was unfair. 2 more councils would be held at Ephesus, but they're not considered real councils by Catholic and Orthodox Christians. The Second Council of Ephesus was notoriously called the Robber Council by St. Leo the Great. In the later 400s, Ephesus was largely destroyed in one of the many wars that ravaged the Roman Empire. It never recovered. When the Crusaders came centuries later, they expected to find a thriving city, and instead found a few scraggly huts. Today, the site has been excavated, and we can see enough of the remains to get some idea of how the people of Ephesus lived when the city was rich and bustling. But Ephesus is gone. As with every one of the churches at the beginning of Revelation, its lampstand has been removed. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Way of the Fathers, and if you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. We are entirely listener-funded, and so we're utterly dependent on you. So please go now to our form at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Send us your gift and let us know that you love the Fathers. And remember, we pray for our listeners and benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.